When we think about important figures in history, Pontius Pilate almost always comes to mind as a name shrouded in mystery and tragedy. But have you ever wondered what really happened to him after that fateful trial? After all, why would the man who washed his hands of Jesus' crucifixion face such a grim end? Isn't it curious how someone who had so much power ended up in such tragic circumstances? At that moment when he released Barabbas and sent Jesus to the cross, Pilate perhaps did not imagine that he was also sealing his own destiny. Pilate's story is a deep dive into difficult decisions, political pressures, and mistakes that have echoed down the centuries. Here, we explore how a man who thought he was above the consequences ended up being marked by them in a brutal way. And if you've ever felt like a choice you made could change everything, you'll find something unsettling about this narrative. Pilate's tragedy is not just an ancient lesson. It's a powerful reminder of the weight of our actions and how sometimes what we avoid facing comes back to haunt us. Pontius Pilate is, without a doubt, one of the most enigmatic figures in the last chapters of Jesus' life. Faced with deciding whether to release Barabbas, a famous criminal, or hand Jesus over to crucifixion, Pilate faced a difficult dilemma. He ended up giving in to pressure from the crowd, even though he knew that this trial was much more complex than a simple choice between right and wrong. This is a powerful example of how a person's destiny can be in the hands of those who make crucial decisions in moments of tension. But did Pilate really have the freedom of choice we imagine? Over the centuries, scholars and clergy have debated Pilate's true role at this decisive moment. Some see him as a weak man, unable to face the popular and religious pressures of his time. Others believe he was actually under extreme political pressure, especially when considering the impact of releasing or sentencing a divisive prisoner. This leads us to think about how, often, people in positions of authority can make decisions that profoundly shape the course of history. In the case of Pilate, he was inserted in a context that did not seem to give him many options. Furthermore, imagine the weight of this choice for a man who was essentially a foreigner, administering a land where beliefs and cultures constantly clashed with Roman laws. For Pilate, perhaps there was no space to follow his personal convictions, assuming a role that distanced him from his individual beliefs in favor of the demands of the crowd. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to make a life or death decision while being pressured from all sides? It is possible that deep down, he had his own conflicts about the fate of Jesus. It is interesting to think that, by choosing Jesus' destiny, Pilate was also shaping his own future. After all, the fact that he gave in to pressure and released Barabbas instead of Jesus created a milestone in history that resonates to this day. And, in the view of many, he became the man who washed his hands of a cruel fate. It is as if every step he took after this decision carried the weight of his choice, which affected both his reputation and the future of his government. What happened to Pilate after Jesus' crucifixion is still the subject of debate and speculation. Would he have regretted his decision, or did he somehow justify himself, believing he had done the best he could under the circumstances? It is this mystery that makes his story so engaging, and that leads us to want to know more about the tragic fate of Pontius Pilate. Pilate was not just a judge in any court. He was the governor of Judea, a defiant province under the rule of the powerful Roman Empire. Judea was not a place like other Roman domains. It was a land with deep traditions and beliefs that often clashed with Rome's rigid, expansionist vision. Imagine a place where every corner pulses with faith and ancient rituals, but which is now controlled by a foreign empire, alien to local traditions. In this scenario, Pilate was between two forces that little understood each other. For him, governing Judea was like balancing a two-sided coin. On the one hand, loyalty to Rome and its policies of control. On the other, a population that valued their faith and autonomy. Pilate constantly dealt with a people who did not see the emperor as a legitimate leader, but as an intruder. Thus, he had to impose Roman law without completely destroying the local culture, something that many of us would not even imagine as a challenge, but which was a heavy burden in his position. The context was a stage of daily tensions. Relations between the Romans and the Jews were fragile and often marked by conflict. mainly because the Jews had strictly monotheistic religious practices, while the Roman Empire accepted multiple gods. For Pilate, understanding this dynamic was fundamental. Previous governors had already failed when they tried to forcibly impose Roman symbols and pagan practices. And of course, history showed that revolts were not rare. Soon, it was as if he was walking on eggshells, trying to prevent the smallest incident from turning into an uprising. This delicate balance caused Pilate to adopt an often ambiguous stance. He was looking for a way to maintain order without inflaming existing tensions, but this, of course, was not always possible. In his attempt to please the emperor and maintain the respect of the Jews, he created a complex reputation. For the Romans, Pilate was an efficient administrator. To the Jews, however, he represented the cold and implacable face of Rome. Who knows? Deep down, Pilate also felt the weight of being seen in such a polarized way. But how far could he go to maintain this fragile peace? Pilate was about to make decisions that would forever change history and put his name on the list of the most discussed rulers of his time. Judea was a true cauldron of cultural and religious tensions. For the Jewish people, monotheistic traditions and beliefs were not just a matter of faith, but a deeply rooted identity. Living under the rule of Rome meant facing the presence of a pagan empire, which, for many Jews, was an intruder that threatened their very essence. Imagine a people who, for centuries, maintained an unshakable faith in a single God, being forced to accept the laws and customs of a nation that venerated several gods. In this scenario, Pilate was seen as the face of this occupation. He was not just a governor. For many, he was a representative of a power that oppressed their beliefs and ways of life. This situation created a field of constant tension, where any decision by Pilate could be seen as an affront or disrespect. There was a palpable sense that at any moment, the spark of a revolt could ignite. The conflict between Roman laws and Jewish traditions made Pilate's government a mission full of challenges. It was almost like living on a fine line between the duty to maintain order for Rome and the fear of intensifying the revolt of the Jewish people. On several occasions, Pilate had to deal with religious issues that went beyond his understanding, as he himself did not share the Jewish faith. This lack of knowledge only made the task more complex and risky. With each new decision, he needed to consider, how far could he impose Roman authority without generating a new revolt? The relationship between the Jews and Roman power was delicate to the point that any gesture, no matter how simple, could be interpreted as a threat. It is as if Pilate's every step is on the verge of collapsing the fragile balance between authority and peace. He had to constantly ask himself whether it was worth challenging traditions or whether it would be better to give in on some issues to avoid greater conflicts. Imagine how exhausting and frustrating that must be for someone in your position. Even in the face of all this pressure, Pilate would not escape mistakes that would further fuel resentment between him and the people he governed. And in one of his most controversial acts, he would make a decision that would inflame local outrage and put his authority to the test. One of the most controversial moments of Pilate's government was his decision to build an aqueduct to bring water to Jerusalem, which seemed like a good initiative. But the problem was the source of funding. He used funds from the Jerusalem temple itself, an action that many Jews saw as a desecration. To them, the temple was the holiest site of their faith, and using its resources for an infrastructure project seemed a direct affront to their beliefs. This choice by Pilate triggered a revolt among the locals, further intensifying existing tensions. This aqueduct, as important as it was for the city, represented something much greater: the interference of a foreign governor in the sacred affairs of the Jews. Imagine what it would be like to see the resources of your place of worship being used without consultation or respect for the community that protected them. In response, many Jews protested vehemently, and Pilate, rather than seeking compromise, chose to repress the protesters, sending soldiers to contain the crowds. This resulted in violent clashes, which only increased the people's resistance against their government. Pilate believed he was doing what was necessary for the good of the city, but the use of these sacred resources overrode local religious sensibilities. In his view, A Roman governor had the right to direct public funds according to his needs, but he did not understand the symbolic weight that the temple had for the Jews. This decision revealed Pilate's disconnection with the local culture and the depth of the differences that existed between him and the people he governed. The community's perception was that he had desecrated something sacred. This decision cost Pilate dearly, both in the respect and trust of the population. By ignoring the symbolic value of the temple, he missed the opportunity to create a respectful connection with the Jewish people. This episode only reinforced the image of Pilate as a governor who neither understood nor valued the importance of local traditions. He was distant, stuck in his position, without considering the cultural roots of the place he governed. This aqueduct episode showed that Pilate, in trying to improve the infrastructure of his jurisdiction, ended up digging an even greater abyss between himself and the people. And this distance would continue to grow, leading him to take actions that would later echo throughout his career and fame. The scene of Pilate washing his hands has become one of the most iconic moments in his history. During Jesus' trial, he took this symbolic action to demonstrate that he did not take responsibility for Jesus' fate, placing the weight of the decision on the crowd. This gesture, in addition to being controversial, marked him as someone who avoided fully assuming the consequences of his own decisions. After all, how many times do we see someone trying to exempt themselves from their choices, as if a symbolic act could nullify their responsibilities? For Pilate, washing his hands represented his attempt to escape a situation where politics, religion, and popular pressure were dangerously mixed. He knew that any choice would be problematic. Releasing Jesus would mean facing the fury of part of the people, while condemning him would stain his conscience and his history. By washing his hands, Pilate wanted, in a way, to protect himself from the judgment he knew was coming, both from the crowd and from future generations. But did it really work? This gesture had a profound impact. It was seen as both an act of weakness and disregard for the moral implications of his position. Pilate avoided a direct decision, but he also left room for the people to judge him harshly. For some, hand-washing represented a cowardly attempt to escape the truth. For others, it was a portrait of a leader who was unable to bear the weight of his position. Either way, he came to be remembered as the man who avoided the responsibility of choosing. Pilate's image was immortalized as that of someone who fled, who did not face his role firmly. Instead of taking a stand, he allowed the voices around him to dictate Jesus' fate, using the hand-washing gesture as a justification for his silence. It is curious to think that, even in a time of authoritarian power, Pilate did not find the courage to face the consequences of his judgment. He gave up on deciding, but this marked him even more than if he had taken a clear stance. However, despite this symbolic gesture, Pilate's fate was far from being light or easy. His life would continue to be marked by controversial decisions, and little by little, he would see that the attempt to wash his hands does not erase the weight of the choices he makes. After Jesus' crucifixion, Pontius Pilate's life did not follow a path of tranquility. On the contrary, his trajectory was marked by a cycle of brutal and controversial events that would lead him to lose his power and, according to some versions, his life itself. Rome began to question his stance as governor, especially after several revolts in Judea that revealed Pilate's difficulty in maintaining order without the use of violence. His position as leader became increasingly fragile, and he faced pressure from all sides. With each decision, it seemed like he was closer to his own end. The erosion of Pilate's authority intensified to the point that Rome was forced to act. The emperor decided to remove him from his role, sending him back to the capital to account for his actions. Apparently, the controversial decisions and excessive use of force to repress the Jews were no longer acceptable to the empire. The irony is that, after trying to wash his hands in the matter of Jesus, Pilate found himself involved in a sea of problems that not all Roman authority could clean up. He now faced the consequences of years of troubled government. There are reports, although mixed with legends, that Pilate ended his days in a tragic way. In some versions, he would have taken his own life, unable to bear the weight of his decisions and the contempt of his homeland. Other accounts say that he was punished and despised even by the Romans themselves. Whatever the version, Pilate's end was anything but glorious. It is as if the weight of Jesus' crucifixion had, in some way, also crucified his own trajectory. He couldn't escape the consequences of what he did or what he didn't do. Pilate's death, if considered truly tragic, raises a series of questions. He went from governor to an embittered and discredited figure, losing everything he believed he had achieved. For someone who sought power and status, the outcome of his life seemed almost an irony of fate. He tried to maintain control during his rule, but the end of his journey was marked by the loss of control over his own future. Thus, the story of Pontius Pilate ends, leaving a mystery surrounding his figure. What would really have been going through your mind in the last few days? Would he be sorry or just bitter? His story invites us to reflect on the impact of our choices and how much they can, in fact, mark us forever. So, what do you think about the fate of Pontius Pilate? It is clear that no matter how much he tried to escape the consequences of his choices, they caught up with him, transforming him into a figure of historical tragedy. But what about us? How many times do we wash our hands at decisive moments, hoping that time will erase our decisions? Pilate's story serves as a reminder that every action has weight, and running away from responsibilities can impact us much more than we realize. If you've also felt the weight of a difficult choice, perhaps it's time to reflect on the impact of your decisions and how much they shape your future. Are we living in a way that builds a path of honor and purpose, or are we just letting circumstances decide for us? This is a powerful reflection and an invitation for you to rethink what you want for your life. After all, isn't it better to accept our choices than to be dragged by them? So, if you want to continue exploring thought-provoking topics like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, there's always something new to learn and reflect on. Don't miss the next stories and teachings that can transform your life.